Hello, 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 viewers. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Gabriel Soto, Director of Research at Edison Research. And today I have two amazing people joining me. Hi, Nidia.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. Hi, Natasha.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. How about you guys?
Great.
Excited
Awesome.
to do this.
Same here. So, just so everyone knows, Nidia Serrano is the Senior Director of Sales Marketing Strategy at SXM Media, and Natasha Stockton is the Director of Communications Planning at Mindshare. Thank you both for showing up today, for showing up for this audience and sharing your expertise. So, viewers, we have a big one for you today. So, whether you're an investor, an advertiser, a creator, you're all here to learn about a segment of the podcast audience that is often overlooked. So, today, Nidia, Natasha, and I are going to share some findings from our first ever comprehensive study that we put together on the Black podcast listening audience. It's called the Black Podcast Listener Report. And Nidia, I have to thank you and SXM Media and Natasha. Thank you and Mindshare for sponsoring this report. You know, it's the reason why it exists and why it will be available publicly on edisonresearch.com after we're done with today's webinar. Now, you've both been pretty involved in this study from the start. What are you guys most excited for our viewers to learn today?
Ooh, I'm excited for a lot, actually. There has been such a need for this type of information in the marketplace for so long, so we couldn't wait to dive into it and get to know this audience a lot better. But personally, what I'm most excited about is just learning about what type of content these listeners are interested in. We know that there has been a lot more interest in podcasting from the Black audience perspective. So I'm just wondering how they're engaging and what types of content and topics they're going into.
Absolutely. Natasha, what about you?
Well, I have to echo Nidia's comments. This research being the first study of its kind, I think that's just absolutely amazing. And some of the insights that came out of this, I think those who are listening today are going to love these insights. For myself in particular, I really liked the insight of how they listen to podcasts. Extremely unique and very particular for the Black audience. So excited to dive into that.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to cover that. And we have a lot more that we're going to cover in this webinar. And what I'm particularly excited about is for our viewers to get involved. So if you're watching this webinar live, take a look at your Zoom menu. You should have a chat option and a Q&A option. In that chat window, go ahead and tell us where you're from, what you do, the name of your podcast. Tell us what you think about the report there in that chat window. If you are unsure about something and you have a question, you'll use the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. That'll guarantee that your question gets answered by someone on the Edison team who's live behind the scenes, ready to answer any questions that you drop in there. So Natasha and Nidia, are you ready?
I am ready.
All
I'm
right,
ready.
let's get it. All right, so viewers, we want you to understand how we collected this data that you're about to see right now. In August of this year, we conducted 2,500 online interviews of adults in the United States who identified as Black or African American. And in case you're wondering, that's about less than 10% of the respondents here in this survey who also identified with another racial or ethnic group, such as white or Latino, in addition to Black or African American. Now, these results, they were weighted to match the age, the sex, and the region of the U.S. Black population according to the U.S. Census. And all the podcast listening data, they were weighted to statistics from our national telephone study, the Infinite Dial. Now, it's that study, the Infinite Dial, that allows us to capture a snapshot of podcast listening and awareness of the medium among Black Americans, and then how that compares to the total population. So let's start with the basics. how many people are even aware of the medium? So on the left, we have the total US population, and on the right, it's the US Black population. In 2021, the yellow, Black Americans are just as likely to have heard of podcasting. 77% are familiar with the term, and it's not much change from last year.
It's pretty amazing. And when you think about it, and when you even compare it to um, previous studies that you have done on the Edison side, we can see that uh, while there are cultural differences among different groups, let's say with the Black population and the total population, this is unlike that study that we did on the US Latino podcast report, where familiarity was pretty low. And we talked about language being a factor there. So it's great to see that because Black Americans and the total population share the same language and they are participating in similar spaces, that there's the similar familiarity that somebody else would have when it comes to this term.
Yeah, and it shows how language will not be a barrier like it is for Latinos in this group, right? If there are barriers to listening to podcasts, it's not going to be language. And there are some differences that we see with all this research. But so let's look at the actual listeners. 40% of adults in the US have listened to a podcast in the last month. That's slightly less among the Black population at 36%. And the needle has moved slightly for both groups since last year. But the real change is when we look at the weekly listening audience. Now, here's a story that we want you all to know. Look at that number far left. 24% of adults in this country listened to a podcast on a weekly basis last year. That same year, 17% of Black Americans did the same, and that's a 7-point gap. Since then, 24% on the left, that has turned into 28 for the general population, and 17% has skyrocketed to 26%. Over a quarter of the Black population today listens to podcasts every week, and the gap has closed 2 points.
That's huge. That I've seen reports that show that the Black audience and how they consume content, that share is shifting. And I think, we'll get into it more, the reasons why the Black audience listen to podcasts. But I think in the past year, with everything that's going on, podcasts have definitely been a place where we've seen a lot more content for the Black audience.
Absolutely. And at this rate of increase, Natasha, along with what we see in the Latino podcast listener report, it's the reason why this year at Edison Research, we have seen the general podcast audience in this country the most ethnically diverse it has ever been since Edison started tracking podcast listeners way, way back when I was still in middle school in 2006.
Wow. I was in middle school too.
I think I looked up the top song in 2006, and I think at the top was Chameleonaire. Trying to see me riding dirty, trying to catch me riding
dirty.
I love that. I was like, I'm sure he has a podcast now.
Yeah, right.
That was a jam.
That was. Now, who are these listeners? We're gonna go back to our Black monthly podcast listeners to see. So remember, we estimate that a little more of a third of all Black adults listen to podcasts monthly at 36%. And this is something that makes the Black monthly podcast listener different from your general weekly or general monthly podcast listener. And it's that the majority of these listeners are female. 56% are women. Now, Nidia, we don't typically see the gender split this way when we look at the general podcast audience in our other research. Those audiences skew male.
That's pretty amazing. And I love how this research off the bat is just debunking myths left and right. Like oftentimes we saw podcasts being a very male dominated space. It was a not very diverse space. And we're seeing off the bat that this is not the case. And I think one of the reasons why this tends to skew female for the Black population is because Black women just have this tendency of breaking barriers and leading the way in many areas, whether it's movements, whether it's entering a new space. We definitely see this being a factor as to why they have a higher tendency to listen to podcasts than anybody else. We also see that Black women lead the way in many areas. They want for their voices to be heard. They have a lot of things to say, and not a lot of mediums are able to give her or give them the forum that they desire for those conversations to happen. So I love seeing that podcasting is really allowing these voices to be heard and for these listeners to dive into topics that they can really find anywhere else.
Absolutely. I feel like podcasting, you're less likely to find gatekeepers in this medium since it is a fresh and newer medium compared to something like TV. But what's also interesting, uh, another interesting thing you can say about this audience is that they're young. So just under half are between the ages of 18 and 34. And Natasha, that's younger than the general podcast audience and younger than the Black population as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because, when podcasts, I think when they first launched, there was this misconception that podcasts were for those who like to listen to talk radio, and it was a very kind of just dry subject matter and not interesting. And as we see from these stats, like that's evolving and it's changing. And I really feel that advertisers need to understand that podcasts are a great way to reach the younger Black demographic, and creators who cater to this audience should understand that this younger audience is going to be something that advertisers start to value.
Yeah, absolutely. And something else that makes these listeners attractive in this advertising world, well, it's coming up right here. We're going to hit our viewers with three other key demographics. The first, employment. And Black monthly podcast listeners in dark blue, they're more likely to be employed than the Black population in the US as a whole. And they're in green in this graph. About 2/3 of Black listeners are employed full time or part time, compared to less than half of all Black Americans in the same boat. Key demographic number two, 28% of Black monthly podcast listeners have a 4-year college degree, while 22% of the overall Black population has one. And now the last demographic that we want to show that will get the advertisers going. 1 in 5 of Black monthly podcast listeners are self-employed, 7 points more than Black American adults in total. Now, let me remind you, Black listeners are more likely to be women, and it's women that are driving that number to 20%. Black women and women of color are starting businesses at higher rates compared to white men. There are many studies out there that demonstrate that. And this is just an opportunity to reach them through podcasts.
So I think this is just continues to prove, right, the power that Black women have in podcast content. These are the spaces that have the content that they need to be able to fulfill a lot of their goals. I personally know a lot of Black women in my circle that use podcasts as a way to learn, as a way to learn from other women and learn from other entrepreneurs about where to go with their businesses. And so it's really exciting just to see the impact of not only having more women in the podcasting space, how that's completely changing the trends that we see with this demographic. But even when we looked at age, we're going to start seeing that because these listeners are younger, they're not only transforming the makeup of who the audience is, but also the content that they gravitate towards.
Absolutely. And the content, that's something that we're going to cover in this section coming up in a second, the podcast listening section. So we'll get into topics, perceptions of podcasts, but let's start with this. So when this group started listening, 42% of the Black audience started listening to podcasts within the last year, which is depicted by that blue and the red bar to the far right. That's a pretty large group, and at that size, You might expect that monthly listeners should have grown by a lot more than they did since last year. Well, we always have to say this every time we look at this data. This doesn't demonstrate growth. It's just a snapshot of Black monthly podcast listeners and when they started listening. Monthly podcast listeners are not a fixed and permanent group. They're fluid. It's a constant flow of new listeners coming in through the front, more tenured listeners exiting through the back, and then you have your lapsed listeners coming back to the group after they figured out how much they missed their podcast. But the good news is that we're still seeing net growth in listening, like we saw earlier. And the key here is that the sizable portion of the current pool of these listeners are new. And what's fascinating is that women are driving that blue and red at the top. Look at how much larger those sections are among Black female podcast listeners. Just under half started listening within the last year, compared to about a third of Black men who started listening in the same period. Black women who listen to podcasts are much newer to the medium. Experiences of new listeners like them are going to be different from yours or mine, since I started listening 4 years ago. Nidia and Natasha, think about how you discovered podcasts for the first time. Now, many people say recommendations from friends and family. I don't know what you guys say.
So when I think about when I first discovered podcasts, I think for myself, um, it kind of came from just some of the content I consume. It would recommend for some of the things I'm interested in a podcast to listen to. And then I also found podcasts through social media. So it's definitely something that I feel that as Black women, we've gotten exposed to more recently since, our voices are being elevated. So I have my girlfriends all the time recommend podcasts to me, and we share what we've heard on those podcasts. I wonder if that was the same for you, Nydia.
Yes, for me, I discovered podcasts just me searching for content that I wasn't finding in other places. So I was interested in learning and getting inspiration from a career perspective. I was looking for information about topics that dove a little bit deeper into some of my my nerdy moments. And that's how I discovered podcasts. So I basically found them through the platforms, not so much through social media. However, I do have to say that a lot of the influencers that I follow, they were starting to push their podcasts really hard on social, and that's how I discovered some other content. So I have to agree with you, Natasha. Social did play a big role in later on me discovering new podcasts to listen to.
Something I love about the stat too is, I saw it on social media is higher than recommendations from friends and family. I hypothesize for Black audiences, sometimes the social media is an extension of friends and family. Like you look at the podcasters that you follow and the conversations that they have, you consider those individuals friends. So I do feel like the two are a little linked. And it's just something to consider for the future too. Like, is this an influencer you follow on social media? Like, I feel that Black audiences do have these, they feel that they have these personal relationships with the podcast creators.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Now, let me ask you both, what attracted you to the first podcast you listened to?
So it's
Ooh.
funny, like going back to the point of about like just going on some of my favorite places to discover new content. So like Vulture is a website I go to quite a bit. I started following Amanda Seales on social media, and she's also an actress and comedian and does a number of other things. But she was plugging her podcast, Small Doses, and that was really what attracted me to go to her podcast because I loved what she would say on Instagram and like some of the things she'd say. So it's like I can get even more perspective from her via podcast.
Yeah, for me it was um wow, there's so many podcasts that I listen to that are not very well known, but it was this podcast from this influencer called the Gold Digger Podcast, and it was about pursuing your goals and all of that good stuff. And yeah, I mean, I found it because she was pushing them real hard on social, and I just got hooked from the moment that I got into it.
Interesting. So for you, Natasha, it was a movie celebrity, and then
Mhm.
Nidia, you would say it was more of an influencer that got you
Yeah.
into podcasts. Yeah,
And the
and then
topic itself, like the inspiration and the empowerment.
gotcha. And that's what most of these listeners say attracted them first to the podcast that they first ever listened to. 46% say it was the topic that they're interested in. 26%, like you, Natasha, say TV or movie celebrity. 25% say a host of a radio show that they like. And, as podcasting continues to penetrate the mainstream, more podcasts are going to come out for more topics that we've probably never even heard of, like you say, Nidia. You listen to other podcasts that are not very well known, and as we continue to see this, um, we're gonna continue seeing stuff like this.
I was gonna add, another interesting thing that I see in this chart is the fact that TV celebrities and radio hosts are almost equal in their influence. And it's just amazing to see that in the podcasting space is like the equalizer, right? Like you can be an influencer, you can be a TV movie star, or you can be a radio host, but you hold the same kind of influence over the listener that maybe an entrepreneur would too, right? It's like the great equalizer across all of the different types of hosts.
Yeah, I like that you say that because it goes back to our point that we made earlier that there's less gatekeepers in podcasting, and that's what makes it so attractive to people. Um, the majority of Black monthly listeners are consuming podcasts more compared to a year ago, and that's true among women. It's true among men. However, men are more likely to say that they are listening more, and that bears out uh, in the time they spent listening to podcasts. Now, this is among Black weekly listeners, and Black men say they spent about an average of an hour more with podcasts than women in the last week. Now, as a whole, Black weekly podcast listeners spend an average of a little more than 5 hours with podcasts in a week. So if you look at the green and the blue sections at the top, that tells us that about a third listen to podcasts for more than 5 hours weekly. This is a group that we at Edison Research like to call super listeners or podcast best customers. So keep an eye out for a report on these listeners later this year. But a good portion of Black listeners are within that super listener group. But going back to the Black monthly listeners, it's no surprise that about a third use a mobile device, such as a smartphone or tablet, to listen to podcasts most often. And, Natasha, you pointed this out when we were reviewing this data together. While the term mobile device suggests people are, moving around, it's actually the home that's the most popular choice, the most popular location for people to listen to podcasts in this group. 92% say that they ever listen at home, followed by 68% who say they ever listen in the car. And that aligns with our general podcast audience. And so does the location in which podcast listening occurs most often for Black listeners. 71% say they listen to podcasts most at home, and 1 in 10 say the car. And another 1 in 10 say at work. Now, the home is such an important aspect of the Black listening experience that we were curious to know if their listening occurred with other people, like we saw in the Latino podcast listener report. And it turned out to be true. 47% of the Black weekly podcast audience who listen at home say they listen at home while spending time with family and friends, compared to 23% of the general weekly audience from our podcast consumer tracking report in Q2.
It just goes to show that wow, this is fantastic because for starters, you would associate podcast listening to a solo activity. what we see here is that for Black audiences, it is not. These topics, these conversations really lend themselves to just deeper dialogue, not only with the hosts and the content that they're sharing with you, but you sharing that with your family members, with your friends, and just continuing the conversation. So it just talks to the depth of the content and just the community building that happens when that content is being consumed. And it also makes you think about, you mentioned that they're spending all this time listening. What are they replacing their time with, right? What are they doing less of to listen to more podcasts? And we're starting to see, and I think Natasha, you mentioned this, that there's a trend where for a very long time, Black listeners were associated with being very heavy TV viewers. And what's happening is that that's shifting slightly, and it's because of all of the choices that the audio space is giving these audiences and this ability to just go into conversations that they just wouldn't really find in other sources, in other types of shows or other media. So it's just great to see how different consumption is for this audience versus the total audience.
I know that it's so interesting, and it speaks to what's important in our communities and how we connect with our friends and family. And you're right, some of that share shifting is moving away from kind of like linear television and live TV, or, the podcasting supplements it. So, like, one of my favorite ways when I listen to podcasts is, I mentioned Insecure earlier and how I found Amanda Seales' podcast. Well, my girlfriends and I, we love watching Insecure, and we can't wait to get together and talk about it. And any podcasts that have that conversation, it's fun to hang out with someone. Sometimes I like to be in the kitchen when I'm cooking, and then I'll have the podcast on, and I can have a conversation with, like when we have like girls brunch and like we're preparing things together and talk about it. So it allows you to multitask and like really kind of create some of those community bonds.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say the kitchen because I listen to podcasts in the kitchen too while cooking with my girlfriend. We have the podcast playing on a smart speaker.
Oh, I
Uh,
love that.
Sometimes you get to a good moment where you just want to keep listening, talk about it. You end up cutting your finger while you're cutting that steak. That happens to me. Um, for me, that's a audio only podcast, right? And we've talked about this before. Video sometimes can make it easier for people to listen to podcasts with other people, and we'll get to that in a second. But we want to show the viewers exactly how many people listen to podcasts with video. And at the top, 3/4 of Black monthly listeners say they ever listen to podcasts like I do, audio only without any video. But about another 3/4 of Black monthly podcast listeners say they ever listen to podcasts with video that they actively watch while listening. And another 59% say video that they play in the background or minimize on their device while listening. Now, in total, the people who say either of the two bottom items there, that number equates to 83% who listen to podcasts with any type of video component. Um, but why do these listeners listen to podcasts with video? Well, here's something, Natasha and Nidia, that it's something that we've never published before in any of our studies. Among the audience that listens to podcasts with video, 40% say it's easier to pay attention to, and about a third say it's easier to watch podcasts with other people than to just simply listen to it, right? That goes back to our point about that we discussed while reviewing this data. It's easier to listen to podcasts when you're actually watching something rather than just watching like a piece of cover art or I don't know what. Um, but
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to that communal aspect of listening, right? If you're listening with other people, what better way to rally people behind by like having something to capture their attention and hey everybody, look at this, let's listen to that, right? So I think that is a different experience when you're listening by yourself. Like that ability to just listen gives you, allows you to just be introspective and allows you to focus on the content a lot better and just kind of dive into your own little world. Whereas when you're listening with others, it may require some sort of anchor that's going to bring people together and pay more attention. So it's interesting to see here in this data that, number one here, one of the reasons why they've listened in the past to podcasts with video is because they wanted to pay attention. And also, it's easier to listen or watch with other people. So I feel like those two kind of have a way to relate to each other in some ways.
Yeah, and we were also talking about how podcasts and these types of video podcasts you might watch with other people, or just audio podcasts, like in our situations when we're in our kitchen and just listening with other people. Um, it's a way, in a sense, to promote podcasts, exposing family members, girlfriends, boyfriends to a podcast that they've never heard before. And by default, any types of brands that are advertised on those podcasts. Um, Another stat that I like here is the ability to read the comments posted by other listeners. 32% say that's a reason for listening to podcasts with video.
And
Yeah,
that's
I think
because
that
it's like
goes.
a dialogue, right? So it goes back to there's a back and forth. You're in conversation with the podcast host versus just passively listening to them.
Yeah, it goes. I agree. I think it goes back to the collectivism, that key value among Black communities, where we just want to be with each other and we want to hear each other's opinions and perspectives and just see what the next person thinks, right? It just makes you feel less alone and makes you see where else you can take the conversation from what you've listened to. So I think it's fascinating that a lot of the data that we see throughout this report just really points to that community aspect of in that behavior that happens in media and just really translating to the podcasting space as it relates to Black audiences.
Yeah, especially during the pandemic, right? And I think, many of these video podcasts are being consumed on YouTube. So what we decided to do in this report is we decided to ask them YouTube related questions about reasons why they listen. And among those who listen to podcasts with video and ever listen to podcasts on YouTube, 42% say they listen to video podcasts because they are already on YouTube for other content. And so as a product of that, they're going to listen to podcasts on there too. Now, once again, this is about podcasts with video. Other reasons why people listen to podcasts in general, those are found here. The lists are among our entire Black Monthly Podcast audience sample, and 73% strongly or some would agree that they listen to podcasts to learn new things. They're also using the medium as a way to find content that they can't find elsewhere, avoid that the podcast medium has filled for much of this audience. And I say that because 70% listen to hear unique perspectives on topics not covered in other media. Now, other reasons that these listeners agree with, here's the second page: to stay up to date with the latest topics, 66% to feel inspired, to hear opinions and perspectives of people who look and sound like you, to escape, 59%. And one of the, topics that you can use to escape, your stressful lives at work, waiting for the weekend, is comedy and music. It's ways to be entertained as well, and those are at the top. About half of Black weekly podcast listeners say they listen to comedy. 43% say they listen to music-related podcasts. Health and fitness, that's something that we typically don't see at the top in our research of the general podcast audience. Nidia, Natasha, what's driving some of that push to the top for health and fitness is the fact that women are more likely to listen to that content.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that influence that Black women have, right? And I think overall, there's just this renowned focus on our health. I think that the past 2 years have really made us take a hard look at our own mortality, at our own lives, our own health, and that of our families. And so a lot of these listeners are just trying to learn more. They're trying to find ways to improve themselves, their physical fitness, but also their mental health. We see a lot of trends in the Black community where there's just this renowned focus on mental health and just really getting the community to think about it differently.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
completely agree with that too. You know, the importance of self care. I also think that self care also links to the type of podcast and like the fluidity and diversity of listening. Like you mentioned, one of the top reasons for listening and why Black audiences listen to podcasts is to learn about new topics, to inspire them, to keep them entertained, companionship. Like those are things that have become incredibly important over the past few years in terms of self care. And you know, looking at these numbers for the Black audience, I just love like the variety of topics that we see on this page.
Hmm. Yeah. Speaking of that variety, that content diversity. Here's the second page of all the other topics these listeners consume. This list will go on and on if we could ask about every single topic that's available, and that's really great to see. It's really great for reaching these consumers by their niche interest. You have topics like religion, arts, anime, and video games.
Put me down for
Topics
video games.
um, I have to start listening to video game podcasts. Winter is coming, and I need a new video game. So I'm gonna ask you guys after this which game I should play.
All right, we
Um,
got you.
so topics like news and even video games. I've seen those with higher percentages in previous research, and the reason that it all ties back to how the gender of these listeners lean female. Since women make up the larger share of this group, you're going to see topics that they listen to higher on this list. And here is one page spotlighting the differences between men and women. Black women are more likely to listen to music, health and fitness, like we pointed out earlier, and true crime. Black men are more likely to listen to sports, which is by far the largest of difference of these topics here. Now, there are more differences between black female and male listeners, which viewers, you can find the report when it's published online. But for the sake of time, we want to highlight some other differences. This time, the differences between the black audience and the general audience. And we highlight three here. Black weekly podcast listeners over index on comedy and music related podcasts compared to the general audience. And they under index on the consumption of history related podcasts. But look at what happens when we ask what if they would be interested in listening to history podcasts if it was about Black history. Here is an overlay of topics the Black weekly audience would be interested in listening to if the topic primarily included Black stories and perspectives. That's the dark blue bar here. And the red indicates that they're already listening to the topic. So for history, the topic on which we saw Black Podcast Weekly listeners under index, 20% ever listen to that right now. But 2/3 would be interested in listening to the topic if it included Black stories and perspectives.
That's amazing. I mean, this is so telling of the room for growth, right? Like there's been tremendous growth with Black podcast listeners in the space, but there's so much more to go. There's so much more bandwidth. And typically Black listeners, Black audiences tend to lead the way in a lot of media. And we always wondered why podcasts weren't one of those. And we see it here. Those perspectives just haven't been included fully. And if they were, wow, like the presence that Black listeners would have in the podcasting space would really outshine any other audiences. And when you think about it, right, it makes a lot of sense. There's just different needs that there are different needs that Black listeners have as it relates to these topics. If you think about the economy and business, right, there's just a long history of inequality from an economic standpoint that will require a lot more, and just a different approach and a different touch for the Black audience. Same with history. Natasha and I talk about this all the time. Like, we need more history podcasts that are connected to Black audiences. How awesome would it be to just hear about just unknown history of just like the Black communities around the world, right? I will tune in to listen to that.
Yeah.
And even true crime, right? I know that you love genres around these categories, Natasha. I would love to hear what kind of things you love to listen to.
Yeah, I'm right with there with you about the history piece. So like we've seen like there is this like desire for more content featuring us throughout history and like proving the misconceptions like there weren't any black cowboys, for example. You see the success of The Harder They Fall in Netflix. And even though that's kind of like fictional history in some aspects, there were black cowboys and like that would be an awesome thing to dive into in a podcast. I'm a huge horror buff. If there was a horror podcast, and if Jordan Peele, for whatever reason, is listening to this podcast, I hope he decides to create a black horror podcast because I'd be right there listening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jordan Peele, listen up. We want that. Make that happen. The black podcast listening audience, they're thirsty for this type of content. They're more likely to listen if we, as an industry, can make it easier for them to find this culturally relevant stories of not just shared obstacles in the black community, but black excellence as well, and then even topics outside of those things. It's very important that the podcast for these listeners include that. And I'm not just speculating here; these listeners speak for themselves in this survey, and 63% of the Black monthly podcast listening audience say it's very or somewhat important that the podcasts they listen to include unfiltered conversations that can't be heard elsewhere. 60% say Black stories and perspectives, and the majority find each of these items important. Over half say that it's important that the podcasts they listen to are hosted by Black hosts. And one way to promote, this sustained listening that we've been seeing is to have more shows with Black hosts. 59% would listen to more podcasts if there were more podcasts with Black hosts.
Yes, and I love the slide that you just covered because it really shows that it's not a let's just put a black voice here or a black character there, which we see that being an issue in a lot of other media. It's not just about that representation. It's about the representation of those stories. And the reason why they love black hosts is because those perspectives are going to come through naturally, right? So when it comes to the content, I think we have a lot to learn from podcasts as advertisers. It's really allowing those stories to shine and from those stories to come from the right people. And it's also about just including perspectives and conversations that are just not going to be as filtered as other media would do. So it's all just comes together really nicely. And our listeners are telling us, right? They love podcasts because of it's really important for them to have these three things is that trifecta of content, of representation, and also the perspectives and the depth of the conversation. And if you don't have those three things in a particular topic or a particular podcast, you may be losing that audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, yeah, it's funny that you say that about the Black host, and this report really demonstrates how important Black hosts are for these listeners. This is probably the theme of, or the major theme of this report, if we had one. 70% last listened to a podcast with a Black host or hosts in the last month, if you combine the red and green. And 41% listened to one in the last week. So Nidia and Natasha, producing a show like you said with Black hosts is one thing, but promoting it, making it accessible, getting it in front of these listeners, that's another thing. And 58% of Black listeners, they wish there were more content around niche interests by and for Black voices. And if you look at item number 4, you find it difficult to discover content about topics that are interesting to you from Black voices because podcast platforms make it difficult. Over a third agree with that statement. And that's all evidence that there's still a lot of work to be done to amplify these types of stories. But you know, I'm personally starting to see changes. Podcast listening service like Stitcher, they're starting to put in an effort to promote this content. You know, I looked on Stitcher the other day, and I was happy to see a curated playlist of podcasts right on the front page there called "Amplifying Black Voices," followed by some podcasts that they curated. And I think others will follow suit because you know, they're going to they're going to start to notice the value of Black listeners when it comes to something that mobilizes everyone. That's the cream, right? The money.
The
Uh,
coins.
Mhm.
and then, so that's what we're going to cover in this section: monetization related data. Like we just discussed, Black hosted podcasts provide a lot of value for brands seeking to reach these listeners and creators looking to monetize their podcasts this way. And it's not surprising, but here are the numbers to show for it. If Black listeners heard an advertisement for a brand on a podcast with Black hosts, the overwhelming majority say they would be somewhat likely or very likely to engage in any of these behaviors. Look how that combination of blue and green is higher than 80% for all items, and very likely that flutters around that 1/3 mark.
Yeah, I love this slide for advertisers because it just shows that Black audiences, they're engaged with the podcast and they're actually listening to the advertisements that do pop up on those podcasts because, you know, for the Black audience, as Nidia had stated earlier, it's about the perspectives and stories being told, and they look for that relevancy, that authenticity, and their representation, and to see support from brands in a very authentic way goes a long way with the Black audience.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. There's almost this waterfall effect that happens, right? You know, these hosts have taken such a long time to create trust and build a connection with their listeners. And when these hosts are the ones promoting these products, these brands, it's natural that they're going to want to consider the brand. It's natural that they're going to trust that brand, right? Like if you, Natasha, had a podcast and you were promoting a product, I will trust you. You know, I wouldn't think that you're trying to sell me something that is not going to work for me, right? You as a Black woman can give me a perspective that that I desire. So I see these listeners having a special connection, not only to the host because they love them and they trust them, but because they have similar needs to theirs, and so they will consider that product just because they already see that from their perspective.
And to your point, I mean, it's you're going to trust a podcast from me because my podcast, if I'm a podcast creator, it's an extension of who I am. It's also my brand. So I want to make sure
Yep.
the brands that are on my podcast are representative of who I am.
Yep.
Yeah, and you know, these listeners have already demonstrated, you know, that relationship with some of their favorite podcast hosts. Look at how many have showed up. These are different ways of how these listeners have supported the podcast that they listen to, either through by following their hosts, the podcast, the creator on social media. Half actually have done that or say they've done that. Another half say by follow they've supported their favorite podcast on a by following the podcast on a service, which are two of the easiest things you can probably do. And 29% at the bottom say by buying branded merchandise. And here on the second page of that list, 27% say they've supported podcasts by subscribing to paid ad-free podcasts. 1/4 say they've actually sent money via services like Venmo and Cash App. Have you guys done that before?
I have
I
not done
have
that.
not.
But I have seen that on Twitter and like some people who started podcasts and maybe they're not a celebrity or again, these Black content creators, like they want their story shared and sometimes it's not always someone who has access to the money because I know hosting a podcast isn't cheap, which makes the support of advertisers even more important to help these creators grow. And then they don't have to worry about asking their listeners for
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I
Venmo or
think
Cash App.
it's true, and I think that these listeners understand that these podcasts that they love, they're not gonna get the amount of money that other creators get, right? They're not gonna get that big audience that a just for lack of a better term, just other white podcasters will get, right? They're gonna attract a wider audience. They're going to attract more advertisers. And so they understand that in order for them to keep these podcasts that they love, keep them available, make them available for themselves, and keep these podcasters and these creators just thriving, they have to contribute. And again, like Natasha said, it's one of the reasons why, as an advertising community, as an industry, we have to stand behind Black creators. There were a lot of brands that were looking to support the Black community in a unique way last year. I think that this is another way. These consumers want their voices heard. The listeners know it, and it's just of utmost importance that this support also kind of falls and waterfalls into these audiences as well.
Yeah, and look at you talk about other podcast creators wanting different audiences, right? But look at how one quarter have said that of these Black monthly podcast listeners have said that they bought from advertisers they heard on their podcasts, and that to me really adds value for these types of listeners. When maybe there weren't numbers available before this study, there are numbers available now to show how willing and how valuable this podcast audience is for these brands, and the brand should start targeting them, start looking for them, and by default, that's another way to support Black creators of podcasts. And 86% here at the bottom, that just means it shows that they're willing to engage, or they have engaged in any of these supporting behaviors in the past. So any of the above from this page and the last page. Now, something else that advertisers, creators, everyone should know is that compared to other places, Black monthly podcast listeners, 40% say they're more likely to purchase a product when they hear an advertisement on a podcast. And there's some differences here between women and men, but the key difference is age. And we made a point earlier that podcasts are a good way to reach a younger audience, and in this case, a younger Black audience, right? Here's another thing that supports that idea. The younger listeners are more willing to purchase a product if they hear the advertisements on a podcast.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And, as advertisers look to basically just have a higher household penetration and get some of those younger audiences, I think it's important to understand what platforms they're going to and what platforms they trust. And podcasts, especially for Black audiences, um, is emerging as one of those platforms, especially for the younger audience. Well, overall, I do think in our industry, I think there should be advertisers should consider podcasts more. And I think one reason that a lot of advertisers haven't completely built a holistic podcast strategy within their current audio strategy is because, as an industry, we're still relying on television for reach, and that visual and kind of getting some of that mass scale. But I think as media becomes more fragmented and we as consumers start to look in multiple places and we are a lot more aware of what brands are saying and how they're communicating with us, advertisers have a newer challenge of finding ways to really connect with consumers in different ways. So we're seeing more advertisers looking for, we say emerging platforms, and podcasts have been around for a while, but podcasts are considered one of those kind of emerging platforms to really connect with those audiences.
Gotcha. So the challenge is scale. And I think today we've covered a lot of ways in which podcasting, especially for this demographic, is valuable for different advertisers. Another point we want to make here is the different and the people that own the content and ads on those types of contents. So we asked the question, compared to ads on content from non-Black creators, would hearing an ad from a brand on content from Black creators make you more or less likely to consider, recommend, purchase, spend more on a brand, right? And this was asked to the entire sample, the 2,500 respondents in this survey. And 40, and then you can see here that 34%, around that one third mark, the U.S. Black population as a whole are more likely to engage in any of these behaviors. When we switch that over to Black monthly podcast listeners, there's a bigger group in the people who say more likely. Um, so it just shows that Black monthly podcast listeners are more attuned to um, content that is non-Black owned versus Black owned, or content that comes from Black creators, and how much more likely they're willing to support that type of content if they know it's owned or created by Black creators.
Well, and it also shows too, I noticed, the slide of US Black population versus Black monthly podcast listeners. It's the looking at reach versus engagement. And if you're on a podcast, it's not necessarily a push for reach, which you will get scale, but it's really about that engagement because if someone is actively listening to a podcast, they're going to be more likely to consider your brand than you trying to get in the media with scale where someone is more passively engaging.
Absolutely. Yeah, for a podcast, you have to be voluntarily involved, while maybe, if you're someone's advertising on a music radio station, people are just can just sit back, and maybe you're not even paying attention, just letting the music play while a commercial comes on and you're driving. But podcasting is a little bit different. Um, well, Nidia and Natasha, that's all the data that we have for our viewers today. And before we let them go, I want to ask you, what are your key takeaways? What do you think you want people to know before they leave?
Yeah, I think that, we saw a lot of amazing data debunking myths that we had about who the podcast listener is. So once upon a time, we thought podcast listeners were mostly male, were mostly white. But now we're seeing that Black podcast listeners are coming in and changing the game. They're changing how podcasts look, what the marketplace looks like. They're changing what the topics that are most prominent on the podcasting space. They're really changing what that looks like as well. So I think one of the reasons why is because Black podcast creators are carving their own space and they're delivering the content that they know that their listeners will love. So it's just, as advertisers, it's really seeing podcasts as a different space to reach a valuable Black audience. And to that, the other thing that I really walked away with was the fact that podcasts really give brands access to a highly valuable audience. They are really leaned in, like you mentioned, Gabe. This is an audience that is very passionate about the content that they're listening to. And so they're more actively listening and more engaged than they would in any other media. So brands really have an opportunity to develop really strong strategies that are going to engage them in a meaningful way. It's such a blank slate, it's such a blank space for brands to come in. And I think that the listeners, they're ready to see brands support the content that they love. I think that podcasts are at a stage where social media was a couple of years ago when it first kind of became very popular, where you just were really excited to see your creators and your influencers get support, right? Get that love. And there's just this moment of pride that you feel like, oh my God, I remember when you had just like a very small audience, and look at you now being sponsored by such and such brand. There's that, level of love and community that exists within, the Black listener audience that's very different from any other audience.
I love that. And some takeaways that I would say to just build on that is just to the point that you were making, Nydia, is that um, Black audiences, we want to hear ourselves in the content we consume, especially podcasts. And it shows that, Black voices matter. And we're expecting the same from the ads that we hear in these environments. We want to make sure they're authentic and that advertisers aren't showing up to just check a representation box, that the ads that show up in there really resonate. And, both the podcasting and advertising industry have an opportunity to drive more growth by amplifying these Black stories and perspectives. Gabe, I love the Stitcher example that you set up top. It's like it's up to us to make sure that Black audiences are able to find these podcasts and that they're able to be accessed by a wider audience. And the other thing I would add is that, this the results of this data shows that Black podcasts ads, they work. You know, the Black podcast listeners, we have a strong affinity for ads delivered by Black hosts. And, you know, marketers can really drive these strong results for their brands by supporting and investing in Black podcast content, you know, helping elevate them and helping support as they grow in this space. And I think a brand can really become a leader in really leveraging the connection that Black audiences have with the Black podcast creators.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Um, well, Nidia, Natasha, thank you both, and thank you to SXM Media, and thank you to Mindshare once again for making this report publicly available, for making this report happen. This, once again, to our viewers, this will be available on edisonresearch.com after the conclusion of this webinar. We'll have more information on the Super Listeners report that'll be coming out at the end of this year. So keep an eye out for more information on that. We'd like to thank you again for taking time out of your day today to spend it with us and learn about this audience. Thanks again. My name is Gabriel Soto from Edison Research. Thank you and have a great day.